Brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A'udhu billahi min ash-shaytan rajim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam wa ba'd. We welcome you all this evening to our ninth class. Alhamdulillah, these have been going by smoothly. Our ninth class in this session of the history of racism and resistance in America. And this particular class, we will be discussing the eras of from Jim Crow to desegregation. And with that, we will have our staff attorney at CAIR, Michigan, do tonight's class. So I will bring her on right now. Assalamu alaikum, Sister Amy.
Wa alaikum salam, Brother Dawood.
Okay, so I will excuse myself, and you will have access to the share screen for your PowerPoint, and then I will come back on for the Q&A. And for those of you who have questions and answers or questions or comments that are respectful or relate to the topic, we will post those and let Amy have the opportunity to question those. And perhaps, as usual, I might throw in my extra 2 cents if need be.
Thank you, Brother Dawood. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thanks for tuning into our class. This is the second class that I'm teaching, and the first class was Black Codes, and now I'm teaching about, we're talking about from Reconstruction era, so right after the Civil War, through literally 1968. And the class I taught before, it has a lot to do with the class I'm teaching now. So the class, we're going to start with what's known as the Jim Crow era. So I'm going to share my screen and get started with the PowerPoints. So I'm going to be talking today from Jim Crow to desegregation. So we're really going to start with by talking about Reconstruction. The Reconstruction period it began right at the end of the Civil War, and it lasted through approximately 1877. And during this time, right at the end of the Civil War, there was many federal protections that were put in place for people who were deemed as former enslaved persons who are now free, and also individuals who were free Blacks at that time who had never been slaves or had been freed prior to the Civil War.
Your PowerPoint isn't on the screen.
What? Oh, I shared my screen. Now let me try again. Thank you, Brother Dawood. Okay. I'm sorry, it's a 2-button click. How about now, brother? It's on? Okay. There we go. Sorry about that, everybody. So during the period of Reconstruction that lasted right after the Civil War, federal troops, they remained in the Southern Confederate states in an effort to monitor those states and to provide protection for formerly enslaved persons. And during the time of right after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, when the federal troops were in place, African Americans were able to vote. They actually ran and won elected offices, and they were able to sit on juries, and they enjoyed some benefits from the protection. But after about 10 years, the federal government withdrew its troops. And when they withdrew their troops, the Confederate states returned to the same rule of law and the same political leaders that were in place during the time of slavery and during the time of the Confederacy. So as one might expect, when the federal protections were withdrawn, protections for African Americans at the time was eroded, and Southern white Democrats began to take power in the legislature in the South. And what we think of today as the Democratic Party is not the Democratic Party of the Reconstruction era South. It's actually quite different. It actually sort of mirrors what the ultra-conservative right has been for the last several decades, actually. So in the late 1870s, the Southern white Democrats, they began to pass laws that were completely and solely intended to disenfranchise African Americans from the political and economic gains that were made during the Reconstruction period. And they took the form of very restrictive laws, such as voter registration laws, electoral laws, and even segregation laws that required the separation of the races in many aspects of life, including where they could live, go to school, what kind of jobs they could hold, and also withheld several important opportunities from African Americans. So in order to do that, because African Americans during Reconstruction were able to vote and able to hold power, in order to enforce this white supremacist ideology in the political South, the Democratic Party actually used very violent tactics to suppress the Black vote and to achieve their goals. And some of the methods that they used included lynchings, arson, and rape. And in fact, there were some 4,084 documented lynchings which took place in the South between 1877 and 1950. So the use of violence and the use of the threat of violence and even murder was really how white supremacy was enforced in the South during that time. So what is Jim Crow? So actually Jim Crow started off as it's a pejorative term for Black African-American men. And it was derived from a minstrel show that featured a white man wearing blackface and depicted an African-American man in very unfavorable light. The term Jim Crow later became synonymous with laws that were passed in the South that established different rules for Blacks than they did for whites. And the laws themselves were inherently intended to ensure white supremacy could stay in place and to make African Americans disenfranchised and subservient in many ways. And when we think about Jim Crow laws, what we have to realize is that Jim Crow laws touched every portion of African American life, including where African Americans could live, where they could work, how much money they could even get paid for doing certain jobs, where they were allowed to eat, and where their children were allowed to go to school. So, and according to the Constitutional Rights Foundation, Southern states began to limit the voting right at this time only to those who could own property or could read well, or those whose grandfathers had been able to vote, and those with what they considered to be good moral character, or could pay a poll tax. And as we spoke about in the class that I taught before, this is very problematic, because when individuals are disenfranchised of their right to vote, they're really disenfranchised completely of all of their political power. And it really started what we consider the structures of racism and the structural racism that still is playing itself out today. In 1896, during right at the end of the Reconstruction period, Louisiana actually had 130,334 registered Black voters. 8 years later, they only had 1,342 registered African American voters, which is really 1% of what it had previously been allowed. This is a huge drop in voting, so you can see how that could affect their rights. In South Carolina, African American and white textile workers could not work in the same rooms. Even they weren't allowed to enter through the same door, or they weren't even allowed to look out the same windows. And many industries that were very prominent in the South and held higher paying jobs that people might consider to be a step up in society, they wouldn't hire African Americans. And what we think of today is labor unions, and we think really, especially in Detroit, we think of labor unions as being really supportive of the African American community, and really gained momentum off of the African American community. When we think about what happened when the UAW, for instance, came to Ford, and it was through the African American community that the UAW became so powerful at Ford as well. During this time when unionization was coming to fruition, a lot of unions actually passed rules that excluded African Americans from joining the union, which meant that there might be a union for the white workers that would protect them with regards to their pay, safety conditions, and things like that. And that just didn't exist for African Americans, so they weren't afforded the same type of protections. There was places in Richmond where one could not live on a street unless most of the residents were people that you could marry. So at that time, what that meant is if you couldn't marry between the races, there was no interracial marriages. It was actually at this time illegal. So if you were African American and you couldn't marry a white person, if the street that you wanted to move into was predominantly a Caucasian street, you couldn't live there because you weren't able to marry into that community. And by 1914, Texas had 6 towns in which African Americans were not allowed to live at all. And this is what we say is sort of the beginning of when we talk about redlining. This is what we mean. We draw like literal lines on a map in communities, and we say that these these communities are only for whites, or this community itself is only for African Americans. So, and that creates a lot of problems with housing and wealth disparity, right? So, and Mobile actually passed a Jim Crow curfew. So African Americans in Mobile, Alabama weren't allowed to leave their homes after 10 p.m. And there were, you could walk down the streets and you would see signs on streets where it would say whites only or colored people, so that it would really direct, even where, based on your race, where you could enter or whether you could even enter public establishments such as movie theaters, restaurants, and things like that. Some other places that we think are like when people would go, they wouldn't necessarily be segregated, but were like prisons, hospitals even. They had African American only hospitals or white only hospitals, and even orphanages where there was needy children. So you can see that the laws really touched every single aspect of an individual's life. Even so far as in Alabama, there was in the courts they kept 2 separate Bibles. So when they would swear you in back in the day, you would actually have to place your hand on a Bible. We don't do that anymore, but they used to. In court, you'd have to put your hand on the Bible and you would swear to tell the truth, and you would do it on a Bible. And they would keep 2 Bibles. So they would have one Bible for African Americans to swear in and one Bible for whites, and things like that just really didn't make any sense. But that was really what took place during Jim Crow. As we just so there's no justice for African Americans in the Southern justice system. So as we discussed in the class I taught about Black codes, directly after the Civil War, many states, primarily in the South, but not completely in the South, New York, Michigan, even northern states that had abolished slavery a long time before the Civil War, began enacting these things called Black codes. And these codes were like very strict local and state laws that controlled how formerly enslaved people could work and how much compensation they could be paid. But they had the literal effect of putting like former enslaved persons back into a status of indentured servitude, and by taking away their right to vote and having a voice in local and state and national politics. And these laws were literally enforced by an inherently racist police force and a stacked justice system. And what that means is police forces in the South were run over with former Confederate soldiers, former slave catchers, and the officers whose former livelihood was to control the movement of enslaved persons. And then after the Civil War, we see these people coming into power through becoming police officers. Or even many times in the South, former Confederate soldiers sat on were sitting judges, and they were deciding the civil and criminal cases that involved African Americans and white people. And this really made it very difficult for African Americans to get a fair trial. And really, this is really what we see as the underpinning of the structures of racism in our prison system, in our judicial system, and even in our policing. And something that's very and not really well talked about amongst a lot of people is the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution is an amendment that was enacted to abolish slavery, right? And it actually effectively ended slavery, chattel slavery. But the express language of the amendment, it really leads directly to the utilization of an inherently racist and unfair criminal justice system that began utilizing African Americans as forced labor by returning them to the status of enslaved persons by criminalizing them, right? So the 13th Amendment is on the screen, and you can read it. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. And it's that clause in the middle, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been convicted, that really allows the criminalization of African American people to turn them back into a body of forced labor. And that's not something that we talk about readily, but it's something that even as I sit here today, really takes place. We used to talk about chain gangs in the South, or we can talk about the firefighters. Even in California right now, they're out fighting firefighters. They get paid very little money for what they do, and they put their lives on the line, and most of them can't even become firefighters when they're released from prison because they have a felony record, right? So we really see this part of the 13th Amendment acting in a way that really undoes the purpose of the 13th Amendment and leads to certain things that we see today, including over policing by the police department of African American and minority communities, overcharging by prosecutors to force people into taking sentences or taking plea deals because they're afraid to go to trial on so many charges. So it's just better for them to take a deal. This led to tougher sentences and disproportionate sentences for African Americans as compared to their white counterparts who are convicted for the same crime, which is something we still see playing out today. And it's something that if you look at statistical data over the years with the war on drugs is very obvious and open. And it's something that started right after the end of slavery. And we see after the enactment of the 13th Amendment, we see individuals were policed and arrested at a much higher rate than their white counterparts. And because the people sitting as their at this time, they couldn't sit on juries. So an African American jury of peers is really an African American jury with all white people on the jury, right? So they're not getting a fair trial, and the judges are former Confederate soldiers, and we see this scaffolding of problematic discrepancies in our criminal justice system. And so when we talk about the structures of systemic racism, that's what we see, that we see this building those structures, right? And it's there is undeniable and impartial statistics that in data that shows that the disproportionate criminalization of African American people really started right at the Deconstruction and still continues through today. So after the enactment of of the 13th Amendment, and we see all of these Jim Crow laws taking place, and we see the criminalization of the African American community. We come up with this term, and it is called separate but equal. So during one of the biggest effects of the Jim Crow laws, and the intent of the Jim Crow laws, was to mandate separate spaces for the races. So all public spaces, including public schools, public places, public transportation, restrooms, restaurants, drinking fountains, and even the military, were all segregated between the races. And one of the express justifications for this segregation was that it was actually for the protection of African Americans, right? So we see people arguing that the separate but equal, the segregation of the races is necessary to protect African Americans. And they're saying it's specifically necessary to protect African Americans, to keep them from attending white schools. And because if they attended white schools, they might be subjected to the adverse opinions of white students, which would create like this idea of a negative race consciousness amongst the African American community, which is in and of itself is problematic, because it inherently assumes racial bigotry, for one thing, that people are going to be racially bigoted, and also that the idea that we're going to protect African American people from bigotry by just making it so that they don't have to confront it on a daily basis is how we're going to deal with it is problematic in and of itself, as opposed to trying to like educate people and stop the racism. We're saying we're going to let the racism go, but we're just going to keep people from having to stare it in the face every day. So it doesn't make sense, but at the time that was the justification. And there was many like legal court battles about segregation, and primarily segregation in education. The schools were they were not up to par for African Americans, and they weren't at the level. But we had this term, and the schools, the court system continuously upheld segregation by this doctrine of separate but equal. And even though we know that nothing was actually equal between the schools, and there was nothing equal between any of the facilities that were kept for whites compared to African Americans. They were facilities for African Americans were consistently underfunded. They were inferior, and sometimes they didn't even exist, right? So we have this idea of separate but equal, but then we don't even have a facility that services the African American community. And one of the pinnacle cases and that actually upheld this idea of separate but equal is thought of as probably one of the worst cases in U.S. Supreme Court history, and it's this case of Plessy v. Ferguson. And in Plessy v. Ferguson, it took place in 1896, where the Supreme Court upheld this doctrine of separate but equal, saying that it was constitutional so long as everybody had their own space and all of the spaces were the same. And this separate but equal ideology lasted for 60 years. Like so you're talking 1896, 60 years from 1896 is pretty much 1960. 1960 is not that long ago. It's 50 years ago. So we see this carrying well in this idea of separate but equal, carrying well into the 19th century and what we consider, the modern day United States. And it wasn't until there was a series of court cases that were filed in several southern states by the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It is an organization that was organized back then, but it's actually still exists today. So one of the things I wanted to touch on a little bit, there's so many things that we could talk about when it comes to Jim Crow and segregation. But one of the things I wanted to talk about today is specifically what happened with the civil rights following World War II. World War II was a time where many people think of the United States really coming together as a unity, as a community to try to really fight off this evil that we call communism around the world, especially after the attack of Pearl Harbor. And but prior to World War II, most African American people, they worked as low-wage farmers, factory workers, or domestic servants. That was really where these laws allowed African Americans to earn a living. By the early 1940s, war-related work was booming, right? So we had this economy that was built on the military and on really the needs of the military as we're fighting many battlefronts around the world. And most African Americans, they weren't given these better paying jobs. They weren't allowed to work in these fields. And they were also discouraged from joining the military. And it wasn't until thousands of African American people threatened to march on Washington to demand equal employment rights that anything really changed. And at that time, the president was Franklin Roosevelt, and he issued an executive order. It's Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802, and he signed it on June 25th of 1941. And what it did, it was the first time ever that it opened national defense jobs and other governmental jobs to all Americans, regardless of race, creed, color, or national origin. And this became sort of like the beginning of the labor movement, right? During this time, it's really the early workings. And we're talking here about 1941. When we talk about 1941, it seems so long ago, but it's relatively recent compared to when we're talking about history, and we're talking about like advancing these ideologies that we think right now are so inherent about equality and justice. So like when we put it in that context, you realize that 1941 really isn't that long ago. And what we know also is that African American men and women, they served historically in World War II, despite the suffering through segregation and discrimination during their deployment. So even while they're out fighting for the United States, and we think that, we honor our military so heavily in the United States, but we have African American people fighting alongside for our country, and they're still suffering from segregation in the military, and they're suffering from discrimination in the military. And what really broke some barriers for African American community is the Tuskegee Airmen. You can see them pictured here, and they were the first African American military aviators ever in the U.S. Army Air Corps. And they earned more than 150 flying crosses, which is a huge accomplishment. And when they returned home, they were met with scorn and resentment and prejudice. And this is like in stark contrast to why we entered the war to begin with. We entered the war to defend freedom and democracy in the world, and then our troops come home and they're met here with the opposite of freedom of democracy, right? So right after the end of World War II, we see the Cold War beginning. It's a period of time where the globe itself is really uncertain of how we're reacting to each other and where we're going to be. And there's a lot of suspicions going around because of nuclear weapons and things like that. But at this time, we see President Truman initiate what is called like his civil rights agenda. And he issued an order in 1948 is called Executive Order 9981, which actually ended discrimination in the military. And then so Truman's executive order effectively stopped segregation in the military. It stopped a lot of the discriminatory practices that were taking place in the military, where certain jobs in the military, certain ranks in the military were not achievable by African Americans. After Truman's executive order ending that, it really opens up a lot of opportunities in the military for African Americans. And what it actually does is it sets the stage for this real grassroots initiative that and push to enact equality legislation and in other aspects of civilian life, let's say, and it really starts to incite the civil rights movement that we come to know as the civil rights movement as we remember it. One other thing that is important to mention, and I'm just going to mention it briefly because I think either next week or the week after we're going to have a class on it, but it's the Korematsu versus the United States decision. And this is an additional blight on the United States Supreme Court when it comes to racial and civil rights and civil justice. And it's a cautionary tale for our country. And during the World War II, they had put all of the Japanese Americans in these internment camps, and they filed a lawsuit saying that was unconstitutional and it was national origin discrimination. However, the Supreme Court upheld that decision. Upheld that during war, we could take American citizens of Japanese descent and put them in internment camps for nothing more than their identity as having their origins from the Japanese community. And we see this as a real issue that really stained American history for a very long time. So we see all of these things happening, and right after World War II, we see the bubbling up of the civil rights movement, and it's starting to gain steam and starting to gain momentum, and people are really starting to fight back and resist against these Jim Crow laws that segregate them from segregate the races. And we see some national groups emerging who are going to be national leaders for the civil rights movement. And one of them I spoke about briefly a minute ago is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is also known as the NAACP. And it was founded in 1909, and it was founded with the intent to stop the ongoing violence against the African American community at that time. And their mission is to secure political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights in order to eliminate race-based discrimination and ensure the health, well-being of all persons. And the NAACP really was instrumental in its efforts to dismantle segregation in the public school system. And they were at the forefront of filing several very, very pinnacle lawsuits in various states that actually ended segregation in public schools. Another group that we talk about is the Congress of Racial Equality. It's also called CAIR. And it was an African American civil rights organization, which was founded in 1942, just around the time that you see FDR signing his executive orders, and you see this momentum towards the labor movement. And its stated mission was to bring about equality for all people, regardless of race, creed, sex, age, disability, religion, or ethnic background. And they were really instrumental in the actual grassroots organizing of the civil rights movement. And as we see these groups emerging as leaders in an effort to end segregation and Jim Crow laws, we start getting these cases that are being decided and brought up through the Supreme Court, giving the Supreme Court really a chance to undo what it did with Plessy v. Ferguson, when we see them saying separate but equal, and in creating this system where they're separate but it's not equal because there's no redress for it being unequal. And the pinnacle case that most people talk about when they talk about the desegregation of the public school system is Brown v. Board of Education. And this case was brought by the NAACP, and it was decided in 1954. And it really is a landmark case in the U.S. And it established that racial segregation in public schools was completely unconstitutional, even if the schools were segregated and equal in quality. It said you can't do that. That's not permissible. We can't have a system of segregation in the United States. And it was a unanimous decision. It was a 9-0 decision, which we never see anymore on our Supreme Court, very rarely. And it literally held that separate education facilities are inherently unequal, and therefore they violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And as you see, we talked earlier about the 13th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment, just to mention a little bit, came just at the same time as the 13th Amendment, and it was passed saying that if you were a citizen, a citizen of any state has to be treated the same as a citizen of all the states. So it really was intended to make sure that the law applied fairly and equally to everybody. So this says that separate but equal is a violation of that amendment, but it didn't really give any like framework or guidance on how we were now going to end the segregation. So it says you can't segregate public schools, but it didn't really provide any technique or methodology for what that looked like or how we were going to do it. It just said that we had to do it with all deliberate speed, meaning like you have to get it done. The other thing is that was happening at this time that was very important is the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and we know a lot about the Montgomery Bus Boycott because we talk about Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks is this big figure in the civil rights movement, and many people know her name. And we have if you live in Michigan, it's like especially southeastern Michigan, we have the Greenfield Village, right? We go to the Henry Ford Museum in the Greenfield Village, and we visit the bus where Rosa Parks sat during the bus boycott. And the bus boycott was really more than just Rosa Parks sitting on a bus and refusing to give up her seat to a Caucasian man. It was really this concerted effort, and it started with that. And even that was like part of the organizational framework for how this boycott would take place and would be pushed forward, right? The momentum for it. And it was considered really it took place in Montgomery, Alabama, and African Americans refused to ride city buses in Montgomery. And it was a big deal. It was a big deal. It really brought the buses to a halt. And the boycott took place for a year. It took place from December 5th of 1955 to December 20th of 1956. And it's really considered like the first large-scale U.S. demonstration against segregation. And as I stated, 4 days before the boycott began, Rosa Parks, who was an African-American woman, was arrested and fined for refusing to give up her seat for a white man. And ultimately what happened is the U.S. Supreme Court ordered Montgomery to integrate its bus system. And one of the leaders that we'll see emerging after that is a very famous pastor who's named Martin Luther King Jr. He really was one of the organizers and the leaders of that boycott. And we see him as a result of this boycott and his other efforts really emerging as a prominent leader of the American civil rights movement. And then after that, we have before that and after that, we have what's known as the Freedom Rides. And this was organized by CAIR, by the Congress of Racial Equality. And what we see happening is in April of 1947, CAIR sent a group of eight white and 8 African-American individuals to what was supposed to be like a week's journey of reconciliation through Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky in an effort to end segregation in interstate travel, because at that time, interstate buses were also segregated. And the members of this group, as they made their way through the South, they were arrested and jailed several times in several incidences. But they started to get a lot of publicity, and this marked the beginning of a larger series of campaigns that took place by the same name. And by 1960s, they started by the early 60s, they started to revisit this issue of these freedom rides, and that's when it got the name Freedom Rides. And on May 4th, 1961, they got on a bus and they journeyed like to what's considered like the deep south, right? And this time it was men and women, and they were testing segregation at bus terminals and not just on the buses themselves. And the riders were met with very severe violence. One of the buses was firebombed. Passengers were beaten by white mobs, and they were attacked in Birmingham and Montgomery. And this started to gain attention, like national attention, and sparked like a series of sparking a summer of similar rides, and that were led by CAIR and SNCC, which is a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Commission, and various other civil rights organizations. And thousands of just regular people went on these rides. And then around the same time, around the beginning of 1960, we see these what are considered the lunch counter sit-ins, which were really known as the Woolworths lunch counter sit-ins. At that time, the lunch counters were segregated, and 4 African American students sat down at a lunch counter in Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, and politely asked for service. And instead of getting service, they got beat up. And they didn't do this one time. They did this a series of times, and that led to a movement, a youth movement, because these were young college students, right? So this really is seen as the beginning of the youth racial justice movement at that time. Around this time, we see Martin Luther King in 1963 writing his letter from what's known as the letter from Birmingham jail, and is authored by Martin Luther King Jr. It's an open letter, and it was like urging people to take their moral responsibility to break unjust laws and take direct action rather than waiting forever for things to go through the courts, because the justice system really grinds very slowly, right? So he's saying, forget it. You can't wait forever. You have, if the law is not fair, we don't have any obligation to follow the law. We have to take action in our own hands. And this is where we get the famous quote that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? And this is, we see him calling for peaceful protests and peaceful nonviolent actions, but we're definitely seeing him call for action at this time. And right after this, we see the March on Washington, which took place in 1963. And it helped to really propel the civil rights movement forward, right? It was more than 250,000 people marched peacefully to the Lincoln Memorial to demand equal justice for all citizens under the law. And at the end of the march, that's when Dr. Martin Luther King made his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. I don't know any history class through K through 12th grade where we talk about the civil rights movement where we don't also talk about this very important and it's very fundamental speech, the "I Have a Dream" speech. So that's when we see this taking place. And then we see in 1967, we see a Supreme Court case called Loving v. Virginia, and it is a landmark civil rights case. And it banned interracial, it determined that banning interracial marriages also violated the Equal Protection Act and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And the decision was followed almost immediately by an increase in interracial marriages in the United States. And people still celebrate this day. They call it Loving Day every year. So we see all these people doing active resistance, and we see these groups emerging, and we see these massive protests at lunch counters. We see them at busing, international busing, college campuses. We really see them everywhere. So what happens right at this time? So we see 3 major federal federal law pieces being passed at the same time as a direct result of this movement. And the first one is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it was signed by Lyndon B. Johnson. And it was really initiated by JFK prior to his assassination, but it was signed into law by LBJ. And on July 2nd of 1964. And Martin Luther King was there as a witness to the signing, and the law guaranteed that there would be equal employment for everybody. It really limited the use of voter literacy tests. It didn't really do away with it, but it limited it significantly. And it allowed federal authorities the authority to go in and ensure that public facilities were integrated. So it really gave some teeth to the bill by saying, hey, if somebody tells us you're not doing the right thing, the federal government's going to come in and make sure that you're doing the right thing. So that didn't really go far enough. And we see just 1 year later, we see the Voting Rights Act signed into law. And that's a very big piece of legislation because it took the Civil Rights Act of 1964 like really one step further, because it banned all use of literacy tests and provided that there were going to be federal examiners in certain voting jurisdictions where there had been massive suppression of the African American in vote. So the federal government was going to come in and monitor these places to make sure that there could not be a suppression of this African American vote. It also allowed the Attorney General to contest state and local poll taxes. So it prohibited the ability for states and local governments to make it too expensive for African Americans to vote. And then later, these poll taxes were eventually considered by the U.S. Supreme Court to be unconstitutional in Harper v. Virginia in 1966. And the last major piece of legislation we see passed at this time is the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which really ended the redlining that began during Reconstruction at the beginning of Jim Crow. And the Fair Housing Act was passed just days after Dr. King was assassinated, and it prevented housing discrimination based on race, sex, national origin, and religion. It is also the last large piece of legislation enacted during what we consider to be the Civil Rights era. And the Civil Rights Movement was an empowering yet very dangerous time for African Americans. The efforts of these civil rights activists and countless protesters of all races really brought about this legislation to an end, but really including segregation, African American voter suppression, and discriminatory employment and housing practices. But it also resulted in large-scale violence against the African American community. And we see things still taking place that are violent. And so we see just 3 years after Brown v. Board of Education was passed, we see the Little Rock 9 incident where there was state-sanctioned armed resistance to the desegregation of public schools when 9 African-American students known as the Little Rock 9 arrived at Central High School in Arkansas, and they were met by the National Guard, who was ordered there by the governor, who at that time was Orville Faubus. And there was also like this screaming mob of people trying to keep them out. And so they were actually effectively kept from going to a school that was being desegregated by the state National Guard at the order of the state governor. And the federal government, under the direction of Dwight Eisenhower, actually had to interfere and send federal troops to escort these students to class. And even after that, while attending classes, still suffered a continuous harassment and prejudice. And on March 7th in 1965, the civil rights movement in Alabama took an exceptionally violent turn as 600 protesters and demonstrators marched from Selma to they attempted to march from Selma to Montgomery to protest the killing of African-American civil rights activist Jimmy Lee Jackson by a white police officer, and to encourage legislation to enforce the 15th Amendment. And as these protesters, they came upon the bridge, it's the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They were blocked by Alabama state troopers and local police sent by the governor, George Wallace, and who was hugely and very outwardly against desegregation. And when the protesters refused to stand down and they refused to stop marching, they were beaten and tear gassed by police, and many of dozens and dozens of these protesters were hospitalized. But this incident was shown on live television, and it became known as Bloody Sunday, and it really appalled much of the American society to see this type of action taking place, and people wanted to fight back and retaliate. But it was Dr. King who said that they couldn't do that, and he really pushed for nonviolent protest. And these protesters later gained the protection of the federal government for another march, and were able to successfully cross the bridge later under protection. But we see this active and very loud resistance, even by the government, to desegregation in the South, and that led directly to the assassination of many of the African American civil rights leaders. And on February 21st, 1965, we see the assassination of our brother Malcolm X, who was a former Nation of Islam leader, but he was a very strong activist in the African American and Muslim community, and he was assassinated at a rally. And we see on April 4th, 1968, we see Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a Nobel Peace Prize recipient, and this really strong advocate for nonviolent protests. We see him being assassinated on his balcony of his bedroom. So while the civil rights movement and the changes that it created are really not that long ago, the remnants of the Jim Crow era still survive in many facets of our structures and systems of racism. We still see it today in our education system. Wealth inequalities, housing inequalities, representation in politics, and as well as our criminal justice system. So while there was a lot of work that was done between Jim Crow and desegregation, we really see that there is a lot of work that still needs to be done. So with that, I would like it to see if there's any questions from anybody.
Thank you for your presentation, Sister Amy. We'll take a few moments to see if there's any questions or comments. I'd like to add on a couple of pieces of things that Sister Amy did in her very thorough presentation. And I think some of this relates to our current political education. And as Malcolm X famously said, of all of our studies, history is best qualified to reward our research. So Amy mentioned certain civil rights laws, such as the 1964 Civil Rights Act, for instance, that was signed into law by President Lyndon Baines Johnson, and those efforts were started under under President John F. Kennedy. They both of them were Democrats. One was from New England, the other one was from the South. And much of this had to do with the organizing that started in the Black community. It wasn't that Kennedy or Lyndon Baines Johnson liked Black people. Actually, it's a myth. John F. Kennedy was the one who authorized the wiretapping and the spying on Martin Luther King Jr. John F. Kennedy, who gave permission to Bobby Kennedy to do that spying during the counterintelligence program and dirty tricks that were done to try to undermine what Dr. King was doing as leader of Southern Christian Leadership Conference leader. Lyndon Baines Johnson continued this program. Lyndon Baines Johnson was actually recorded on audio calling Martin Luther King Jr. the N-word, right? And on more than one occasion. I think that we as Muslims in our political education organizing it's not important that politicians like us or feign like they like us in public, right? And I think that we need to understand this as far as going into the next administration with President-elect Joe Biden. This is one point to make. The other point to make is that, and we'll get to this a little bit more in 2 weeks, but we use the term desegregation specifically, and not integration, because America has never been integrated, and it's still not integrated. As a matter of fact, there are studies that show, and this will be touched on more in 2 weeks, public schools in America are more segregated now than they were in the late 1960s, like before Amy and I were born. Like we don't even know, we don't know a time in our lifetimes of schools being less segregated than they were before we actually were born in America. So I want you to chew on that a little bit, and that still relates to housing and a lot of issues, even in northern areas. We're not talking about the South. The third thing is this relates to people who aren't African Americans who can look black or appear to be black, and there were policies to segregate people, not just in Jim Crow states, but in northern states as well. So I will give you an example. A controversial figure, an Egyptian by the name of Sayyid Qutb, came to America to study. He stayed here for a few years and studied in university. He's Egyptian. His hair was not straight. He had a tan, maybe close to my skin color. In Colorado, he and some of his friends who were Egyptians tried to go into a movie theater. The movie theater was a whites-only movie theater. They did not allow Sayyid Qutb and his friends to go in until those Egyptians who spoke up, who looked like black people, said, "No, we're not Negroes, we're Egyptians," speaking in their accent. And then the movie theater guy let them in after he found out that they weren't African Americans. But Sayyid Qutb, he refused to go into the movie theater because he was insulted. But the other Egyptians, they went in there and saw the movie, right? So it's just to say that even on paper, if you don't appear to be African American or Black American, but based upon phenotype, that if you're not considered white, then maybe you're not all the way right. And that's I've heard stories about Sudanese Americans who are Arab Americans who've been pulled driving while black. They're not African Americans. It didn't matter to the police, right? It didn't matter to being profiled in other places. So these are just things to understand. We are not an integrated society. We're working towards more equity in our country, but in a number of metrics, America is more segregated today than at the time of when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Let me say that again. In certain aspects of American society, America is more segregated than when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. And so I want you to chew on that and think on that, of how we can look at the importance of civil rights work in this particular era that we live in 2020. Sorry for the long comment, Sister Amy.
No, I think it's important for people to realize that especially after Obama was elected, we have this ideology that we perhaps live in a post-racial society. I think Trump, 4 years in office, did a lot to dispel us of the myth of being in a post-racial society. But many of us believe that we've come past that, and really in so many ways we've either been stagnated in the same position and even sometimes went backwards from where what gains we achieved in the civil rights era. So I think it's important for people to realize that.
Okay. Thank you. I don't see any questions, so we will conclude with that. Next week, we have a very special class. We have someone who, as a young child, lived in the concentration camps in California, which Japanese Americans were interned in. So we have a Japanese American coming to us next class to talk about the internment camps, or some say concentration camps, others say imprisonment camps, that American citizens were placed in. They were ripped out of their homes and put in camps during World War II, and some were born there or raised in there. We have one special speaker next week who will be speaking about that, as she was a little girl in the concentration camp, and not in Nazi Germany, in California. So that's for next class at 7 p.m. And then also tomorrow, if you go on MCWS's website, we will be having a discussion about the trials of Imam Jamil Al-Amin and the case of Imam Luqman Abdullah rahmatullahi alayh. We will be discussing that. You can go on our Facebook page and look at that, or MCWS's, and view that. And also mention that Imam Jamil Al-Amin, by the way, this is a side comment. Sister Amy mentioned SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that was an organizing group of young African Americans, students. Imam Jamil El-Amin, aka H. Brown, was actually the chair of SNCC after Stokely Carmichael, or Kwame Ture, was the chair of SNCC. And the chair before SNCC, before Stokely Carmichael, was Congressman John Lewis at the time, who wasn't a congressman. But it just goes to show you the history, and even that Muslims, prominent Muslims that are still alive, quite old these days, but actually were involved in the movement back in the 60s. So we just want to mention that. Thank you all very much for attending this class. You can go on our website for more information regarding our classes. I think we have 3 more classes or 4 more classes left. And also, this is Laylatul Jum'ah. This is now the Jum'ah night in which Almighty Allah, God, increases our blessings, including multiplies the reward of the zakat and the sadaqah that you give. So take advantage of this night and give some sadaqah to your community civil rights organization. CAIR Michigan is scrolling right there. You can give a secure donation for the pleasure of Allah, or you can give it on behalf of a deceased loved one who's passed on. It can benefit them. Or you also can give sadaqah on behalf or with the niyyah of shifa, or for healing for someone that you know is sick, including someone who may be suffering from COVID-19 virus. As a matter of fact, I need to give some sadaqah this evening for someone I know with COVID-19. So with that, thank you very much. Subhanaka Allahumma bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wal 'asri innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa 'amilus salihati wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sallam. Assalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.